Before we get started, I want to remind everyone that the information in this presentation is not to be or construed as investment advice. The information presented are subject to change without notice, and while we have made every reasonable effort to ensure that the content is reliable and accurate, we have not independently verified the content and are not responsible for errors therein. Please consult a professional advisor before putting a loonie in any of these financial markets.
Hi everyone, my name is Richard Diaz and welcome back to the IceCap Canadian Market Wrap. After last week's big, beautiful budget deficit announcement, this week was actually kind of slow on the economic data front. So in this week's episode, we're going to tackle the labor force survey data that came out last Friday and what it may or may not mean for the economy going forward. So let's get right into it. On the surface, October was a good month for employment growth. Nearly 67,000 new jobs were created, and this is after 60,000 jobs were added in September. It's also looking like my prediction that January would be the peak in employment for this cycle is going to be wrong. Although stubbornly, I haven't fully conceded, and I'll explain why in a minute. A look at the sector breakdown, and we can see that the increase was driven by more people working in wholesale and retail trade, about 41,000, transportation and warehousing, about 30,000, and information, culture, and recreation, about 25,000. On the other hand, employment declined in construction, and that's a really important sector for Canada, as we all know, of course. And if that continues to decline, it will drag on employment going forward. We think the recent jump in employment is due in part to the improvements in business sentiment for both the manufacturing and service sectors. This chart is of the S&P Global's manufacturing and service PMIs for Canada. It's a monthly score where above 50 signals growth and below 50 signals contraction. However, according to these PMI reports, there remains significant uncertainty in the outlook, and this has led to a, quote, circumspect approach to staffing and purchasing decisions. And we can see that reflected in the nature of the jobs created in October. Canadian employment growth was strong on the back of part-time employment, whereas full employment fell. From an economic perspective, full employment is simply more important. There are just more jobs, they're generally paid more, and they are on the whole more productive. So a decline in full-time work and a rise in part-time work is actually seen as a red flag. Over the last few years, I've been extremely critical of the explosion in public sector employment without better healthcare or improvements in public services to accompany them. I was partly vindicated by last week's budget announcement where there was a clear plan to reduce the overall number of public sector employees. We'll see if they stick to it. But in any event, October saw a contraction in public sector employment, but it still remains at a 30-year ex-COVID high of about 22% of total employment. In the release, a decline in hours was also mentioned. This is sometimes viewed as a big red flag, something that's negative for the economy or a harbinger of things to come. But this time, lost work hours was likely due to labor disputes occurring during the specific time where the labor force survey is conducted, October 12th to October 18th. So we'll hold on judgment until things normalize. On a year-over-year basis, total hours actually went up by 0.7% in October. Of course, when looking at the labor market, we need to look at the unemployment rate. And here again, there is some good news. The unemployment rate fell by 0.2 percentage points to 6.9% in October, down from the 7.1% in August and September. These were the highest levels since May of 2016, of course, excluding the COVID pandemic. Mercifully, the youth unemployment rate also fell. But big picture, this significantly understates the youth employment crisis. This is because the youth are leaving the workforce. And you can see that in red with the number of inactive people between the ages of 15 and 24. When one normalizes the participation rate, the dotted line in the chart before you, the youth unemployment rate is actually still at a 32-year high. And this, of course, is what happens when you import millions of low-skill, low-wage people. But I digress. Sticking with the theme of participation, we saw a bounce for prime age workers, which is unambiguously good. And it was also good that the overall employment rate for the economy rose. Even though it is still extremely low, rising is better than falling, of course. However, I will warn that this series can bounce around a bit, so again, I'm not totally convinced we're out of the woods. What's cool, if you're a data nerd like me, is that in each release, they will include some kind of cutout of an interesting statistics. In the past, we've seen youth unemployment, and this month we got a survey of Canadians living in a household experiencing difficulties meeting its financial needs. And as you can see, although it's slightly down from a couple years ago, 27.7% of Canadians aged 15 and older were living in a house that found it difficult to meet its financial needs in terms of transportation, housing, food, clothing, and necessary expenses. Still not good. All right, so back to my prediction. We mentioned earlier this year that January figures might prove to be the cycle peak, and so far we are wrong about that. The reason I hold on to that view, perhaps stubbornly, is because the year-on-year growth numbers for the labor force survey continue to diverge from the survey of employment, payrolls, and hours, the more reliable, albeit less timely, of the two employment statistics. The latter is seen as more reliable because it is simply a count rather than a survey and then modeling. And as I understand it, the deviation is due to, in part, to population growth estimates that have exploded and are still normalizing. As we look forward, we see the payroll count looks like it's about to hit zero. And I still think that the payroll survey will be revised down to meet the payroll count. As we bring it home this week, I just want to remind everybody of the fact that you do need decent growth for sustained employment growth. And unfortunately, as we can see from the estimates, those little dots in the dotted line, that GDP growth estimates for this year and next year are continuing to be very, very low. Without improvements in those numbers, I think that any job growth data will continue to disappoint, even the labor force survey, and then unemployment, even though we've had a reprieve this week, will continue to rise. We'll see. All right, that's a wrap on this week's episode. Thanks again for watching. Please like, subscribe, and follow for more. And as always, we manage money for families all across Canada and the world, so feel free to get in touch.